All right, well, everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining us from all over the world for our webinar today. Our topic today, as you know, is under pressure. What can indirect procurement do to tackle global inflation? And this is, I think it goes without saying, this is an extremely hot topic. And it's also, interestingly enough, a pretty unique one because as we among the panel have talked about over the last couple of weeks, it's for many folks, and I suspect many of the folks who are on this call today, on the webinar today, it's the first time in 4 decades that we're grappling, or you're grappling, with any material level of inflation. So it's new and novel for so many of us in terms of what we're doing. And I'd add to that also, before we were kicking off, Chris Sawchuk, I'll let everybody do introductions in just a second, but Chris was talking about, a lot of folks don't have that muscle memory. And we were joking that, you have to have that muscle in order to have that memory come back to you. And I think, for a lot of folks, it's a very new and unique experience. Of course, even for those who were around back in the 80s and 70s, when we last saw material inflation, even the world and the environment that we work in is completely transformed. To use all the great cliches, we're far more global, we're far more interconnected. Supply chains are far more complex. And so even for those who have tackled inflation in a past life, we're still dealing with some unique challenges. And hence we thought this topic would be particularly relevant. And to help us along in having this conversation, and really the goal over the next hour is to have a pretty casual, pretty specific conversation around this topic of inflation within indirect. We put together an esteemed panel. And what I'll do is, instead of me introducing the panel, I'm going to go around, and if the panel can introduce themselves, that would be great. Carol, if you could please kick us off.
Thank you. Again, my name's Carol Kozar. I work at SAS Institute. We are an analytics company headquartered out of Cary, North Carolina. I'm here with one of my colleagues, Darren, and I'll let him introduce himself as well.
Hi, my name is Darren Bachman. I'm a principal procurement analyst and a team lead of the global operations group here at SAS Institute in Cary, North Carolina. And I have to give a little shout out to North Carolina. We were named the #1 business location in the country to the state to work at today.
Oh, was that the CNBC?
That was, yes. So you were watching.
Okay. Yep. I missed what the actual city was, but congratulations.
Yes, well, it's not the city, it's the state. The whole state of North Carolina is the #1 place to do business with in the country.
So anybody looking to set up businesses who are on this webinar, Carol and Darren are your folks to
Come
get
to North Carolina. It's a beautiful place.
All right, Chris, please.
Yeah, good. Well, I guess that you can't say good morning because it's morning where I am on the east coast of the U.S. in Tampa, Florida. But Chris Sawchuk, I lead our global sourcing and procurement advisory business at the firm, and have been doing that for a couple of decades now. Now, what does that mean? We do a lot of research. We do a lot of research in a lot of different areas, and many of you may see some of our research in some of the business publications that are out there.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. Graham.
Hello, I'm Graham Crawshaw. I'm the Procurement Content Director at CASME. And at CASME, we support indirect procurement. We've got a membership of over 200 organizations. So I've got the advantage of being able to share with you some of the views and perspectives that we've gathered from the results of benchmarking we've carried out. So looking forward to sharing that today.
And I'm Omar Abdullah. I'm one of the founders of the Smart Cube. We are a procurement intelligence and analytics firm. We work with procurement organizations on a day-to-day basis across the category management strategic sourcing process. And this issue of inflation is one that, as you might imagine, is something that we're front and center trying to help our clients figure out as well. So excited to be here with this panel. For the folks who are listening in, the composition of the panel is very intentional. Carol and Darren are bringing a practitioner's point of view, specifically in terms of how they grapple with this issue of inflation and all of the related complex issues that we deal with there. And then Chris, of course, brings the wealth of knowledge that he's built up and works with his clients on in terms of dealing with inflation and broader issues as well. And Graham, of course, represents the CASME community and everything that he's been hearing from the CASME side, and likewise from what we hear from a SmartQ perspective in terms of what clients are grappling with. So as I mentioned, our conversation today is going to be very focused on this issue of inflation within indirects. And we've structured this conversation in 3 parts. We're going to go through 3 specific questions. The first one is, how is inflation impacting indirect procurement today? And we'll kick off with a conversation around that. The second question will be, what key strategies can practitioners consider to manage inflation? So we want to get a little practical and talk about steps that everybody is taking or hearing about other organizations taking that is driving some material impact. And then last but not least, how can we best prepare to mitigate the risk of further inflation in the months ahead? So it's not just about what we're doing today, but how can we better prepare ourselves as we move forward? Because, well, we'll get a sense of it from one of the polls that we're just about to talk about, but this issue of inflation may not be fleeting in its sense, and may be around for a little while. And of course, the question is how long is anybody's guess, but it certainly will be around for a little while. So that's the structure of the conversation today, 3 broad questions that we'll be tackling. Before we kick off with the first question, let's do a poll. So our poll is, how critical is inflation as an issue for your procurement organization? Please pick the one that is most relevant. Option 1, it will be the #1 issue for the next 12 months, so a near-term issue. Number 2, it will be the #1 issue for the next 12 to 24 months. Number 3, it is in the top 3 and will be for the next 12 months. And number 4, it is in the top 3 and will be for the next 12 to 24 months. And then lastly, it's one of many concerns, but certainly not in the top 3. So please take a moment. We'll give everybody a few seconds to plug in their responses, and then we'll kick right off.
We kept the question quite straightforward, but again, you got to think whether it is your #1 issue or in the top 3, and also the duration. And of course, is there going to be a prize for anyone that gets it right? I think there should be, Omar. If only we knew. If
only we knew. All right, so let's give, we've about 400 people on the webinar today. I'll ask our trusted marketing folks. So Graham, are you seeing the responses coming in?
Yeah, I think 80% of you have voted. So I think that's a good time, in the interest of time, to end the poll. And there are the results. So it would look like it's in the top 3 and going to be an issue for the next 12 to 24 months. And in fact, 45% have responded to that effect. So that's a very loud and clear message. Not the only item that's causing concern, but certainly in the top 3.
Yeah, no surprise. From the panel, any surprises as you kind of hear that it's in the top 3 and will be for the next 12 to 24 months? Anything strike you as?
Not really. I wouldn't say I was surprised. I think it's interesting that, the difference, if you see the 2 highest percentages, 45%, saying it's in the top 3, 25% saying the top 3, but just the length of duration. Today we've already been talking about the fact that we saw the inflation report come out, at least, within the US at, a very high level. I think it was 9.1%. And so I think what we're seeing is, the majority of folks are seeing this as more short-lived, especially if they feel like it's going to get back to a more normal level within 12 months, and some 24 months. And that's very similar to some of the studies that we've done within our client base as well.
Yeah, and you've got to imagine, as we look at what's happening from a supply assurance and supply availability and continuity perspective, as I was going to say, as countries open up, lots of countries are opening up, but as we see what happens in China in particular, I wonder how much of that will flow through and ease things on a broader basis. But
yeah, because you definitely see a dispersion of the inflationary rates around the world. Certainly highest in Western Europe and the US, but the rest of the world is not necessarily, specifically China, is not, at least not reporting inflation rates anywhere close to what we're experiencing right now.
Right. Technically, there is no inflation there. All right, but moving right on. So with that as the backdrop, let me start. And Carol and Darren, let me ask you this first question, which is, how is inflation impacting indirect procurement today? What are you seeing as a practical impact?
Well, I think if you talk to all of our suppliers are basically saying that inflation is impacting them. Now, our question in our job is to figure out, is that an actual true statement, or is it more of an opportunist statement? And I think that, you know, in our daily lives, we see these things coming at us through the news that inflation is up, but at the same time, if you drill down, not everything is being affected by inflation. So that's why you have to challenge some of those suppliers and ask questions, you know, because if it comes down to it, once you drill down, you may find that those suppliers are not really being affected that much by inflation, which then gives you a great negotiating point.
And then similarly, I think, you know, in procurement, one of the things you think about is you negotiate a contract, you put it in place, and the hope is that it just kind of sits in a drawer, sits out there, but you never really have to revisit it because you've done a great job with that. But it is forcing us to dust off a lot of those contracts and start really reading into some of the language. And we're reevaluating some of the language that we've included in our contracts to see if there's ways that we any changes we need to make in order to help protect us kind of going forward.
Right. And the other thing is, I would say for long-term contracts, you know, we're looking at them now thinking, you know, inflationary, you know, points are transitionary. So we're thinking that the inflation is going to drop off. So the long-term contracts that we would maybe normally write are not being looked at as hard as maybe a short-term contract right now.
Right. So allowing for flexibility,
yes,
without locking in. I'm curious, to Chris's point about the varying rates of inflation depending on where in the world you are. I'm wondering if you're seeing any diversity in terms of that inflationary pressure across, I don't know if it's category groups, if it's across geographies as you look at it. Are you seeing some of those differences? Is it most prominent here for those of us in the US? or in Europe or elsewhere? Are you seeing any sort of patterns or differences there?
I think the way SAS is structured, majority of our indirect expenses are coming out of the US. And as a procurement organization, we tend to hit the big hitters. So our focus primarily is US.
Yeah.
Where we're where we're seeing, you know, one of the largest impacts.
Yeah. Yep. Chris, yeah, go ahead, please.
I was going to say that as you look at it, you know, and you say, well, how is it impacting indirect? You know, and I absolutely agree with what Carol and Darren have mentioned, is that you really have to go down at a more granular level and look at, you know, what are you buying, and then what are the components of that, and what is really being impacted by the inflation, because it's not uniform across all areas. And so as you look across, you know, all of the various categories and subcategories and subcategories that you focus on, you have to understand that you're going to have different strategies for each of those areas. The other thing I would encourage organizations to look at is what I call horizontals. You know, a lot of times we look at categories being verticals, but there are areas of spend that cross all, you know, categories. And a big example of that is labor. And if, you know, and I know that, you know, Carol and Darren, you made a comment that, you know, a lot of your indirect is actually coming out of the US. And we are seeing, you know, various, you know, levels of inflation in labor and constraints within the labor forces itself, depending on where you are. And one of the more concerning areas is the US, but it's also occurring in areas of Western Europe, you know, and across other geographies as well. But again, seemingly most pronounced within the US. So when you look at that and say, well, where does labor fit into all of the indirect spend that I have? You know, this is what I would consider a vertical or a horizontal that crosses all of these different areas. And you might want to not only come up with category strategies, but these horizontal strategies of looking at spend that's common across all of the various areas.
Right. And we actually do have a strategy against labor that we can share with the group as we progress to the strategies, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. The other aspect that I sort of take away, and Graham, I'd be interested in a second in your perspective from a CASME community perspective as well, is the a lot of the talk today, and I appreciate that there is news isn't news unless it's, controversial or bad news. And there's sort of this talk that inflation is here and inflation is here to stay, that we're in a new world, we're back to the 1970s, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But an undercurrent of what I'm hearing from Carol, Darren, and Chris, what you said is, I don't want to overuse the word fleeting, but there's a sense that, look, it isn't necessarily permanent, certainly not permanent in terms of the kind of numbers that we're seeing today, 9.1% in the US that's come out. But that there will be some resolution to this, to the extent that you have resolution in these sorts of issues. Does that align with your view that, I think it's a serious issue today? In the next, as the poll said, 12 to 24 months, we should be able to get a grip on this and move on from there.
I hope so, is the answer. Certainly when we did our polls, the view was it was fuel that was the main concern, the impact of gas, utilities, that we've seen the very high costs associated there. So a combination of fuel, commodity prices and production costs, and linked often to the shortage of components that really were, in addition to labor, as you say, Chris, sort of really triggering almost that perfect storm that so many contracts include a combination of that. Yeah. And I think it's understanding more about what you are sort of buying. I think, yes, we only need to talk about logistics, and that involves so many categories, then yet fuel has been a big impact. And that's as a direct result of the Ukraine crisis. Whether that's going to be resolved in 12, 18, 24 months, not sure. But I think you're right by saying not everything should be just escalating and getting carried away like it did in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Well, the challenge, I have one point on that, because it brings up a very interesting situation as you compare to the 70s, and you talk about that, the fact that not everything is, supposedly inflationary in this current environment. And that there is a lot of granularity that we have to go through to understand the rates of inflation and why is it. And this is where you look at, there's good reason why we're dealing with some inflation today. We had the supply constraints, coming out of the COVID-induced environment that we're in, and for a lot of different reasons. We have labor constraints as well. At the same time, we had, massive capital infusion into the marketplace to shore things up, and now we're reducing that and have cut that off. And so you have these imbalances that have caused the inflationary environment that we're in today. Yeah. The biggest and most scariest thing in my mind in an inflationary environment that we all have to be very cautious of is the psyche. That we become accepting that this is an inflationary environment, and people just start saying, oh, well, it's inflation, that's why it's going up. Yeah. And what I like to see when we just did that poll, and the procurement professionals, 400 here around the world are all saying that this is short term, right? It's going to last 12, maybe 24 months. That gives me a lot of encouragement and faith that we are going to be taking the actions necessary to not allow this to become part of our psyche on a go-forward basis.
Yeah. And I think the rest of the world's also betting on the United States. If you look at the dollar right now, the dollar is actually increasing in value, whereas the rest, and I think the rest of the world is betting on the United States that the Fed is going to control this. I think there's another 75 basis points on the table that's going to be raised, and the rest of the world is looking at that, and I think that's why the dollar is increasing.
Yeah. Great time to be traveling outside the US.
Not for us, it isn't, coming from the UK.
Yeah, so on that point, let's go to our second question. And Darren, maybe if you can maybe kick us off there, what key strategies should practitioners consider to manage inflation? So what are some practical steps today? There's some elements of what you just talked about, what everybody talked about, that'll apply to our third question, which is how do we mitigate going forward and how do we think about this issue? But let's talk about practical strategies today. What are you, Carol, yourself and Darren, what are you doing today to tackle this issue?
Well, I think, one of the biggest things that we're looking at is cost avoidance, but, cost avoidance is not cost savings. But in this inflationary period, I think anything that you get as either a flat rate or some type of mitigation, you're protecting your P&L. So if you can just right now hold your cost flat, even though it's not being something that can be reported, I think you're doing a great job. So, that's one of those things that we could do. And when I say cost avoidance, there is so many things that you could do just by, adding an extra warranty, anything that is, a non-price list item added to your purchase to help with, the increase in prices. So, that's the cost avoidance is a big thing. Everybody here is trying to do it. And on top of that, the cost savings, we're trying to reduce costs as always. I mean, that's our job here. But right now, I think the biggest thing that we are doing is cost avoidance and just trying to hold things steady.
And along with that cost avoidance, I think that means partnering with your technical partners and finance and really thinking through, we've got the impacts of COVID, we've got this hybrid workforce. It's really hard to even predict what volumes are going to be like for certain things, housekeeping, how often do you have to clean the buildings, how, food services, how many people are going to actually be on campus and looking to eat. I think it's a team effort. So I think working with your functional areas and really putting your heads together and kind of coming up with strategies on how to move forward is critical from a cost avoidance standpoint.
And if there is ever a time, during inflationary times to put on your creative hat, now is the time to do it, because really you have to really think outside of the box, think of new strategies, even kind of back up the time. What were we doing in the 80s to try to avoid some of these things? One of the things I even remember to do is what we call a downward negotiation strategy, where we actually go to our suppliers. We all know that, in training wise, procurement gets, a fraction of what salespeople get. So given that you have more negotiation knowledge, going down to your suppliers, if you have a real true partner, and be able to work with them to negotiate their rates so that you get a lower rate, has been something that I have done in the past.
So are you suggesting too that, this is an opportunity to do some additional training with your procurement staff on how to be successful
Absolutely
in this environment?
Yes.
So there's two parts to what you just said, which I think are really fascinating, right? So one is internal, the other is external. In other words, with the supplier partner, specifically on the internal piece of it. So that's interesting. So that's essentially going back and saying, well, look, there's one simple approach is, supplier X is coming to me and saying, I need a X% increase, right? 10%, whatever the number is. And we can talk about strategies to tackle that. And Graham, I'm going to come to you in a second, because I know Kasmi's done a bunch of work in this space. And Chris, I'm sure you'll have a perspective on that too. But what you're talking about essentially is rethinking. It's aspects of demand management. Let's rethink what we actually need within this category, and the specifications and the requirements and volumes and all of those things, and maybe find opportunities to optimize there in the event that we cannot do anything about that price increase, right? So that's an interesting process in of itself. So I'd like you to speak a little bit, first off, on that point in terms of what that means, because that requires it requires more from the procurement professional, better relationships, et cetera, to be able to do that. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about some of those dynamics and what it takes to be successful, to rethink those things internally, number one. And number two, we'll come to the supplier piece of it, because that partnership demands a whole different mindset as well, right? As opposed to the traditional, if I can use the term adversarial approach of buyer supplier, it's a very different mindset there. So maybe you can speak to both of those dimensions and parameters.
Well, I think the first piece, as a procurement professional, we see our role as a business partner, and not necessarily the expert, but one that brings the right people together to have that dialogue. So, your technical partners are busy. They're trying to figure out how do they get things done, but you need to pull them into the dialogue. You also need to look at finance and figure out, is there finance, payment terms, other strategies? What can we do? Can we get creative and pull those people together and have that dialogue to map things out? So more of a you know, a facilitator in that role to kind of like we're having this call today. We bring the right people together and we discuss the issue, and hopefully we learn from it as procurement. Then we kind of hopefully walk away with some nuggets then that we can try to implement.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Even, you know, looking at shipping, you know, knowing that, okay, shipping costs are going up higher. Is there a way to maybe buy a larger amount at this junction or something like that? That's what I'm saying. You have to put your creative hat. This is just not buying a widget and getting it here. You have to kind of go, well, if we go this direction, what do you think about that? Or if we go this direction, what about that? It's more of a collaborative, you know, effort at this point.
A simple example is housekeeping supplies. Where we knew that the prices were going up, we anticipated they continue to go up. So then we thought through, okay, what's our 6-month demand going to look like? And that, given the hybrid work schedule, it's kind of a challenge to kind of figure out what that is, but kind of bring folks together, try to figure that out, and where appropriate, you know, buy ahead.
Right. Well, and actually one of the things we did for our housekeeping supplies is we got into a group purchasing organization. So we have that GPO now and is giving us that that extra buying power, which then reduces our cost dramatically to be able to not really, and again, this is one of the strategies to deflect inflation because we're in that group purchasing organization.
And that's fascinating. I think that makes a lot of sense. How about on the supplier side in terms of, now, in order to be able to sit down with the supplier and say, look, okay, I appreciate you're asking me for this. Let's have a conversation. What does that entail? Is that like open book?
Right. And this is, I'm going back to the 80s when I was, you know, buying more manufacturing parts, and I know that kind of dates me a little bit, but anyhow, what I've always found is purchasing organizations, or at least the support for training on purchasing. I mean, there was a 2014, the last one I saw from CAPS Research is, you know, purchasing was about $900 for training per year, and sales is about $7,000 for training per year. So those numbers alone tells me that, you know, if my organization, if I'm not getting the right training, that means my suppliers are probably not getting the right training either. So since I do have the ability that I am trained maybe a little bit better than some of my suppliers, the offer came out to, hey, you know, can we, since we're such a very strategic partner, how can I help you with your purchasing so you can help me? Yeah. Yeah. And that is a very, very strategic role that in negotiations and just kind of helping them out. And that is a very successful model if you can do it right.
Yeah, I think that speaks even more broadly to, there's a clear demand for a greater sophistication of procurement practitioner too, right? Yes. And that training is required because it's not about the, you know, the proverbial traditional, again, to use a cliche, the hammer that we bring to the table, but it's the fact that we have to bring a toolkit. And the toolkit has to be applied depending on the situation to solve that particular problem. I think that training point is a really important one. I would say, you know, if there's a truism, if that's the right term, I don't think any procurement organization spends enough on training for their people, particularly given the environment that we're moving into. Graham, I know CASME's done a lot of thinking and canvassing of thoughts from the member community. What are you hearing? What are you seeing in this regard?
So certainly what I'm hearing is procurement's in a position to actually demonstrate the knowledge that it's got. And I think a lot of that does come down to understanding sort of cost structure breakdowns and price breakdowns. We also know there's a lot of companies that are trying to take advantage of high inflation by increasing their profit margins. We know the large global consultancies that are actively promoting that. So procurement, in contrast, needs to demonstrate that it's got a good understanding of how prices are broken down. I'm certainly seeing more examples of breaking pricing or cost down and having those elements linked to different indices. Specifically paper, pulp, all the packaging connected expenditure items. If you link it to an index, and appreciate that's not always easy to do, but then you're more likely to allow that flex of prices to go up, but also equally come down. And interesting, in our most recent event on packaging, people were not only looking to use a pulp index, but also looking at energy and labor and almost combining it all together to really demonstrate an understanding of what that cost looks like. So I think challenging suppliers, demonstrating you know what you're talking about, putting those commitments to actually link prices to an authorized index is a good way, at least to stop the supplier from taking advantage, because you can't always have those amazing relationships. Sometimes it's assessing, well, where is that balance of power?
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
I think that makes sense. You know, and I know Kasmi, Graham, you and Kasmi have a report that actually talks a lot about inflation and mitigating the impact, and touches on a lot of these strategies, right? And whether it's, you know, increasing the length of the contract or incorporating trigger pricing, you know, we certainly talk a lot about should cost modeling and having greater transparency. But I think this idea of bringing data and intelligence to the table is an important one. The more you know, the better the conversation you can have, and the better the ultimate outcome as well, in order to be able to tackle issues like, you know, margins and all of these aspects.
That sounds like an advert for one of our previous webinars.
Which you can find on YouTube, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Chris, how does that resonate to what you're seeing with your work that you do, with the research and thinking that you're doing at Hackett, and what your clients are saying?
Yeah, well, I would absolutely agree with what has been said already in terms of the intelligence capabilities that you have to have as an organization. And, you know, and again, this helps, you know, to understand the reasonableness of some of the price increases that suppliers are trying to pass through. But at the same time, informing your clean sheeting, your cost modeling, should cost modeling that you're actually putting together. And that becomes a skill that everyone needs to have, and understanding that these models aren't necessarily perfect, but we need to continue to inform them over time. You know, one of the things I was gonna, and I have to look at my notes here because it's a survey that we did. We did actually a survey at the beginning of the year asking organizations, you know, what are some of the things that you're doing to actually respond to the inflationary environment? And then we did it, you know, more recently as well. So we've run the same survey asking it. And what's interesting is that the responses have been pretty much the same, small changes over that period of time. And so, you know, when we ask organizations, you know, what are the ways that you're responding to this environment? You know, number one, in all the times we've run it, has been, you know, looking for alternative supply sources. Number two was passing on increases to customers. And when you look at that, you know, this is where, you know, the procurement organization has an opportunity to work very closely with the sales side of the house, you know, both on the direct and indirect. I know this is about the indirect side, to see what can we go do. You know, if we're not able to do that, then you're just going to be experiencing margin compression within your organization. The third thing that organizations highlighted is something that we've all highlighted already, was the intelligence that we need to have to support some of the cost modeling activities that we need to go do. You know, number four was around bundling more stuff together. Again, a very traditional, but if we haven't done that, this is the time to go do that. Organizations are also saying, well, you know what, if we're going to have to accept these types of increases, we're going to cut budgets in other parts of the company. And so this is where you're starting to see, you know, headcount reductions in some organizations, especially in the technology industry. Organizations are also doing physical hedging and saying, you know what, if we believe that, you know, pricing is still, and, you know, we're going to continue to see this inflationary effects, we're just going to, you know, increase our inventories. And again, this is something that's more common on both the direct and, you know, in some areas, the indirect side as well. So we're seeing some of these things. I think the last area was around specification changes. Well, one of the things that's very interesting about the environment that we're in today is, you know, I know a lot of us, we struggle with our organizations and, you know, suggesting, you know, specification changes. Depending on the type of industry that you're in, there may be long-term qualification processes that have to be put in place to go through that. Today, there are many more, many people in our companies are open to doing those types of things because of the inflationary pressures. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's one of these things where you always have to look at the glass, you know, half full or half empty. And here's an opportunity where it's half full. Some of the things that we felt in supply management and the commercial side of our business that should have been done a long time ago in terms of, you know, really reconsidering, you know, doing some value engineering, et cetera. Well, we have the wind at our back right now to actually consider and get the organization aligned with us to take on some of those types of activities.
Yeah.
You know, and I could continue to go through a number of different areas, but I do find that we're finding, you know, the idea of these cost management, you know, entities coming together, you know, cross-functional, cross-business. This is not the time. This is the time to come together as a company to create that kind of synergy within the organization, from the customer all the way out on through supply, and what can we go do. And this is where you want that alignment between, if we're accepting a 10% increase, you know, is that something that we can pass on to our customer as well? And we need to have that alignment in collaboration with our sales, operations, you know, go-to-market types of organizations as well.
Yeah, I like that. If I sort of encapsulate what everyone has said, I like that idea that, you know, there's sort of this traditional narrow view that somebody comes to me and says, I need a 10% price increase, that the only answer is, yes, I'll take it, or no, I won't, or okay, instead of 10, can we do 8? Can we do 7.5? Can we do 6, or whatever the number is? But actually, there's a toolkit, an arsenal of you know, arrows, mixing my analogies here, but that we can utilize to really tackle this, right? Whether it is extracting more services for the same fees, whether it is changing the specifications, whether it is, you know, playing with all of these different levers, including managing what that price increase would be. And I think that's an important point to remember. In order to do that, I guess we also have to be able to, as category leaders ourselves within, actually it doesn't matter if it's direct or indirect, it's applicable to both, but certainly indirect, as we're talking about that here, is to understand what those levers would be and what we're willing to challenge. So to the point that, Chris, that you just raised, you know, challenging the way what we've been buying for years. And do we really need that? And can we rethink that? Can we change that and you know, move forward? I think in some of the aspects of what's happening in this digital procurement space, right, where I know there's this whole debate of end-to-end versus best of breed, and, you know, there's sort of this ecosystem-based approach. I think that's lending itself to more flexibility as well, certainly as we go forward. We may not be there today, but it's an interesting space, an interesting play.
But ultimately, Emma, you do need a win-win situation with your suppliers.
100%.
You can't have, and in fact, I don't know whether it's in the US, but certainly in the UK, we've almost had this public fighting between the major brands and the supermarkets, Heinz, Mars, to name two, with the major supermarkets actively saying, look, if you don't accept the price increases, we're going to remove the products from the shelf. And that has happened. You cannot buy Heinz ketchup in a Tesco store at the moment, for example. And it just needs that, with the balance of power, with all the conversations we've had around risk management, you just got to work it out and get to that negotiated settlement, rather than just sort of have one party really disgruntled.
100%. And sorry, Chris, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, as you've been, you know, talking, is that, you know, these periods of time, and I made the comment before, the analogy of the half full glass or half empty, and how you look at things. But, you know, without constraints, without challenges in our environment, we don't have to change much. You know, the constraints, the challenges, the conflicts, what we're dealing with today drives creativity. It drives innovation. And without it, it really, you know, stagnates us as organizations. And so, you know, as challenging as this environment is, it really is a significant opportunity for us, for some of the examples we've already highlighted, to do things that we just haven't been able to do before.
Yeah, it pushes us to do that. Absolutely, 100%. I'm mindful of the time. I do want to get to the next poll and the third question, but I'd be remiss if I didn't just touch on this cost avoidance topic. As everybody knows, there is a school of there's a school of thought where a lot of folks will say, I'm not even going to hear about cost avoidance. It's not something I will consider. It is off the table, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's another school that says, well, it's real and it's material. I don't want to get into the definitions of cost avoidance, because I think we can talk about that all day. What I'd be interested in everybody's perspective, and maybe Chris, if you can share some of your thoughts, and then Carol and Darren, And Graham, your thoughts as well. But just very briefly, is it relevant to talk about cost avoidance with your CFO today? Number one, and CFO/CEO, and how do you make the case for it? How do you convince them that it's relevant, if so? Chris, if you want to kick us off there.
Yeah, I'll provide some perspectives, and you're right. I mean, it's always been one of these areas. I've had clients in the past that, the only thing they want to talk about is deflationary, basically savings, not necessarily anything to have to do with avoidance. Avoidance always come to the forefront in, environments like we're in today. And, when we look at savings in organizations, we look at total cost savings, we'll look at the avoidances plus the reductions. And what's always interesting and not surprising in the inflationary kinds of environments, that total savings, cost reduction bucket, the higher percentage, the percentage of that bucket that is avoidance increases. But that doesn't necessarily mitigate the credibility issues that we have and procurement and supply management around trying to quantify what avoidance always is. And so that's always the challenge in coming up with a proper index. Because at the end of the day, I would argue that our companies don't actually care about the amount of savings that we're making, the avoidances, et cetera. What they care about is competitive advantage. Am I doing better than others? And this is something difficult for us to quantify. But that's where we need to get to. And I think, in that kind of environment, then the avoidances, even though they're going up, but if they're not going up as much as my competitors, then I'm creating an advantage in the market for myself.
Yeah. So clearly greater acceptance, probably by necessity. Carol, Darren, does that resonate? Does that make sense?
Well, 2 years ago was the first time I started in my end of year summary to talk about cost avoidance. I'll tell you right now, we don't have a solid definition of it. So it's more of a, here's some big savings that we can't count as cost savings, but had a huge impact to the company's bottom line. So I'm still thinking through that process, but clearly between COVID and inflation and everything that we've gone through in the last 2 years, cost avoidance, we spend a lot of time on it. And as a procurement organization, we do want to tout it to the CEO. We want to talk about the things that we're doing. Now, granted, cost avoidance is generally not something we can do alone, but at an organizational level, yes, we're saving the company money, and hopefully that results in better earnings overall. So still trying to figure that out, at least from a reporting standpoint.
Well, and the other thing is, I think, some of the things that everybody's talking about your analytics, your data, and everything that's coming through, to put your procurement person in the position where they have to understand these things so they can write something like an outcome-based contract. It's a cost avoidance contract in reality, but is there any way to really report that? Because your outcome could be based on the economy. So yes, you're saving money because your contract reads that you're not going to have that inflationary period because you have an outcome that this is the way the economy is going. So, how is it that you really capture those things? And outcome-based contracts are some of the hardest contracts I've ever had to write because they're tied to outside inflationary kind of numbers and things like that and data.
Yeah. So greater acceptance for sure. Yeah, I wasn't suggesting there was a simple answer to this because if we haven't figured it out so far, we're not going to get there.
The reason is that several of the comments are saying if it's not on the P&L, it doesn't count.
Right. And I think earlier, I said we're right now we're just protecting the P&L with your cost avoidance.
And look, I've had CPOs directly tell me if it's cost avoidance, I'm not, I don't count that. This was a few years ago. I'd be intrigued to hear their perspectives today, because I'm sure there's some evolution to that thinking. But just again, mindful of time. This always happens. We try and leave time for at the end for Q&A, and I know we're going to be up against the wall to do so. But let's go to before we go to the last question. Let's put up the second poll that we have, and that is, how is inflation being tackled in your procurement organization? So please select the most suitable option that applies. Do you have a formal defined plan that is measured and managed across the functions, meaning across all categories? Or do you have plans in place for specific categories only? Or do you have no formal plans and you respond to supplier requests individually, sort of an informal approach? Or last but not least, yeah, it's a flat rejection across the supply base of any inflationary price increases. Is that the strategy? So we'll give the 400 plus people a few seconds to plug in their responses.
And we've included that last one because I've heard that from category managers almost in despair that the situation that they find themselves in. So it's not a fictional option, and people are responding to that, as you'll see in a very short while. Whether it's advisable to do that, not sure, probably not, but nevertheless, it is an option there. So just give people a few more seconds. You can click more than one if there's more than one that applies to you. So just waiting for the responses to come in. And I know they're coming in, but we've got some clear results. So in the interest of time, I'm going to end the poll and share the results so that you can all see. So clearly with the lead, which is interesting. So no formal plans and responding to suppliers' requests. So that would imply that we're not being that proactive, rightly or wrongly.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think, maybe, it goes back to the first question where I think, the majority of folks, I mean, it looked like, either expecting inflation to last, 12 months or maybe 24 months. If you have an environment and a population that's expecting this to be more short-lived, then you have to debate, how formal do I want to get in this? Or do I want to do it more responsive or reactionary, as what's been highlighted here? So.
Yeah. Carol and Darren, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Does that resonate? I mean, actually, the point about inflation being fleeting, not to overstate it, that would make sense. That strategy would make sense. Your thoughts?
I think we were all a little overly optimistic on how quick this would resolve.
Right.
And I think we're coming to the realization that it is.
But there are
longer.
some things that are actually showing. I think automobiles was one of them. There's a couple things out there right now that are starting to retract in inflationary prices. So I don't have the list in front of me, but they talked about it on CNBC this morning. But there is a reversal in some of those things. I think it's all of a supply and demand thing. As the Fed raises its rates, it's going to slow the economy. And if the Fed continues to do what they're supposed to do, again, it will reverse the inflation and then put us to more of a deflationary and hopefully not a stagflation period.
And hopefully that is right for, I mean, I've seen people saying the rates in Turkey are 50% plus, Argentina 70% plus. So there's some parts of the world that there's obviously great concern and that we need to have it brought under control.
Yeah. And I think
I saw one of the comments on here, from, I was just watching the chat a little bit, was around that, there's some of the things that we have talked about. We're talking about muscle memory earlier, is that, potentially part of the reason is that people aren't necessarily trained and really have a good plan going forward. And that's part of the reason we may not have, something more cohesive in terms of our approach right now. Yeah.
It's interesting times. Darren, your car example is particularly interesting here in the US. I went into a showroom a couple of weeks ago and there were 2 new cars only in the entire showroom. And it was more economical to buy a brand new car than to buy one of their used cars. As weird as that sounded. Sounds so.
And to be honest, there's I guess for a Ford Bronco, they're putting a $30,000 upcharge on it. So the people that are buying the Ford Bronco is paying the $30,000 for the car, $30,000 for the upcharge. There's a whole slew of conversation of what's going to happen in about 3 years when people want to go trade in those cars because they're going to be underwater.
Yeah, right. So for the Americans that are on this webinar, please look after your cars because
that's right.
It's not the right time.
Don't buy a car for 2 years.
All right, let's go. We have about 9 minutes left, but let's tackle our third and final question, which is how can we best prepare to mitigate the risk of further inflation in the months ahead? So in other words, we've talked about strategies right now, but what can we do to lay the basis so that we're better able to understand, see, and react, or rather proact or react to inflation going forward? Chris, would you like to kick us off there?
Well, I was actually going to wait for everybody else to make a comment because, I may have more of a contrarian kind of view here that, again, if some of the things that we are doing do help us to resolve the inflationary pressures that we're having right now, then we got to be thinking beyond that in terms of, what happens, if we go into a recession. And again, I liken it to, doing some scenario planning because we don't fully know what's going to happen. And I think, if I was to advise anyone, it's that we have to have that agility as an organization and have thought through, different scenarios over the next 12 to 24 months. And how do we prepare our organization for those, various situation scenarios that might unfold, because we very well could have a soft landing, as the Fed would highlight, and we're off to the races in a much more managed growth environment. We could go into a recession. We could continue to experience the higher inflation that we're dealing with today. So I think we have to be prepared not only for the inflation but all of these different scenarios.
So let me posit a point of view then, and maybe Carol, Darren, Graham, maybe if you can react to this. And this is sort of embedded in, Chris, what you just said and what we've talked about over the last hour or so. I'd say, I think you're right. I think, locking in to specific strategies on categories may or may not be a risky move depending on what the category is, right? And depending on how long inflation is going to last, how extreme it's going to be, et cetera. I'd say the underlying factor that we should take away from all of this is we just need better insight or data or intelligence into what's going on, be able to model scenarios, to be able to look at trends and patterns in the underlying economics by category, and whether that's should cost modeling, which came up earlier. We do something called inflation modeling for indirects, which is a sort of a weighted approach to cost modeling on a time basis. I think the point is, the more you know, the more agile you can be. The better you are based to be able to react to that. Is that fair, Carol? Darren, does that make sense?
Yeah, that puts you in a better negotiating position. So yes, so everything that you just said is correct, and then negotiate.
Yeah.
And the other piece, and again, we agree to join the call, not as experts and with all the answers, but this has been a great learning experience. And one of the takeaways that I'm walking away from this meeting today is really sitting down and writing down the list of all the various options we could be looking at. So making sure, because there are so many different strategies to be able to kind of outline as many as we can think through. And then as we go through looking at each commodity strategy, which one fits where, and not just kind of leaving it up to chance, kind of just having that checklist of, are we considering all of these options,
right,
when we're working on the strategies for particular commodities going forward?
100%. Graham, any last closing thoughts there before we go to, we might be able to get one question in?
I think my comment would be to try and follow the trend and not the price spikes that we've sort of experienced. Right. Easier to say.
Yep.
How easy is it to actually do? Not sure.
Yep. Okay, well, look, we're at 5 minutes. As always, the plan is always to leave 15 minutes for Q&A. We pretty much never do it. But here we are. I think it was a good conversation. Graham, do you see is there a question maybe we should pick up?
Yeah, I've got to try and focus it down. We've had loads of questions, and we may take these offline and respond to people with a blog or something. But can we expect inflationary increases to set a new baseline and remain? Or is it reasonable that prices will actually come down? And at what time can we expect suppliers to pass on cost savings when that happens?
Simple question.
Yeah, well, I think, this is really the responsibility of that category manager. As we were talking about cost modeling, that's not just important on the way up, but it's also important on the way down. And, we need to be, one of our responsibilities to ensure that costs that went up and inflated during this period of time, that we're taking them out and rescinding some of those increases on the way down. I think the mindset that we have to be in is that don't accept these increases as permanent. We have to be in a mindset that these are temporary because of some of the imbalances in supply and demand and other reasons in the current environment.
I would make it part of your contract and make it part of your KPIs so that when you have your conversations with your suppliers, that is a topic that can be brought up. And then obviously, if it's in your contract that you can renegotiate during your KPI, then you would have a great opportunity to get the lower price.
Yeah.
What type of question should we be asking suppliers regarding inflation?
Anybody want to?
I guess where is it coming from? In your industry, is it coming from, or let them talk actually, because it would be interesting. When I've asked my salespeople, a couple of people, they don't have a real good answer. So that's where I kind of think it's more of an opportunistic throw. Hey, I have to raise my prices, but you really have to just drill down to find out where is it coming from.
Yeah, I think this goes back to that point of the more information, the more data you have,
right?
Whether it's coming from yourself as you understand the category better and the economics behind the category, or what the salesperson is telling you in terms of the underlying aspects, that gives you more credibility, a basis to say, this is legitimate, it's fair, and it makes sense, and we can agree to something, versus no, it's more opportunistic in nature.
Okay. Also, questions about the duration of contracts. Should we be actually looking to reduce them or increase them, with all the pros and cons of both options? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say, unless you have an excellent price, I would probably, at this inflationary period, I don't know if it would be great to be investing into a long-term contract, because you're buying now when prices are high. So it would make common sense that you just don't go with those long-term contracts if it is tied to an inflationary period, and then just renegotiate as the, to see what happens, because nobody really knows what's going to happen. But that, again, that's where you're tying everything back to the data.
Yeah. So
I would say that the only thing that I would say is I don't disagree. I mean, and I guess what a way I would say it, if you're going to move into a longer term contract, because that could give you some leverage today, with suppliers, is that you have to have flexibility in those contracts to fluctuate with the changing environment going forward.
Right. Yeah. And that turns into that out-based contract that I was talking about earlier.
Exactly.
And maybe that's the trade-off, right? I'll give you a longer term contract in exchange for flexibility, so we're aligned.
Yes.
That as prices adjust, we adjust along with it.
Yes.
Right.
Okay. I think we're there.
Out
right?
of time.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me close up. There's a few thoughts I just want to quickly touch on that I think were really interesting. One is this issue of inflation being not fleeting, but let's say a temporal issue. Let's not lock in for the long term. Let's look at it on a category by category basis. Chris loved the idea about looking at not just the verticals, the categories, but horizontals, and looking across aspects such as labor. Clearly, closer partnerships, both internally within the organization and externally with suppliers. We all talk about being customer of choice, supplier of choice, but this is where the rubber meets the road. More training for procurement professionals, please. That's, I think, a resounding yes, not only in this issue, but beyond. And at its fundamental level, more data, more insight, more intelligence that you have, the more agile you can be, and the better the decisions you can ultimately make. So thanks very much, everybody. Carol, Darren, Chris, Graham, as always, for being here. Thank you for the 400 plus people that dialed into the webinar. We really appreciate your time. Sorry we couldn't get to your questions. I'm sorry we never do, but we'll try and tackle them in a separate blog or some sort of a follow-up. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Have a great
Bye-bye.
day.